Picture, if you will, a figure moving through the pre-dawn mist along an abandoned road in the wilderness. In his hand, he carries a sword whose lineage stretches back further than most kingdoms, and on his shoulder rests a bow of dark wood, unadorned but deadly true. He is watching, always watching, watching for the shadow that creeps from the mountains. He is a ranger of the north, one of the Dúnedain, and he is utterly, completely alone. The cities his ancestors built are gone. The kingdom they ruled is ash and memory. But he keeps walking, keeps watching, keeps the long vigil that no one asked him to keep, that no one even knows he is keeping. To understand the Rangers, to truly comprehend the weight they carried and the tragedy they embodied, we must first travel back thousands of years to a time of unimaginable splendor, to an island kingdom that rose from the sea as a gift from the gods themselves. This is the story of Númenor, and it begins in the aftermath of a war that shook the very foundations of the world. In the first age of Middle-earth, there was a great and terrible conflict called the War of Wrath. The Dark Lord Morgoth, the first and most powerful of all evil beings, had enslaved much of the world under his iron rule from his fortress of Angband in the far north. Against him stood the elves, ancient and mighty, and alongside them fought certain tribes of men who had proven themselves noble and true. These men were called the Edain, which simply means the fathers in the Elvish tongue, for they were the ancestors of all the great lines of humanity that would follow. The Edain fought with courage that amazed even the immortal elves. They stood beside their allies in desperate battles where the very earth cracked and mountains fell. They held the line when all seemed lost. They died in numbers, beyond counting, but they never faltered, never turned their backs on the fight against the darkness. 3 great houses of the Edain distinguished themselves above all others. The house of Beor, dark-haired and wise. The house of Hador, tall and golden-haired and fierce in battle. And the smaller house of Haleth, forest dwellers and hunters without peer. When the War of Wrath finally ended with Morgoth's defeat and banishment into the void beyond the world, the Valar, the godlike powers who shaped creation itself, looked upon the surviving Edain with sorrow and admiration. These men had lost so much. Their lands were destroyed, sunk beneath the waves in the cataclysm that ended the war. Their numbers were grievously reduced. They had given everything in the service of a cause that was not even their own, fighting to save a world that had given them little but suffering. And so, the Valar made a gift unlike any given before. Far out in the ocean, in the waters between Middle-earth and the undying lands of the Valar themselves, they raised up from the seafloor an island of surpassing beauty. It was shaped like a 5-pointed star, each point a peninsula, reaching into the surrounding waters. At its heart stood a mountain called Meneltama, the pillar of heaven, and from its summit, on clear days, one could see the shores of the blessed realm itself in the far west. This island was called Elena, which means starwards, but it would become known to history as Númenor, the Westernesse, the land of gift. The surviving Edain were invited to make it their home, and in the year 32 of the Second Age, they sailed west to claim their inheritance. Guiding them was a star in the sky, the same star that marked the sailing of Eärendil the mariner, who was himself half elven and half man, a symbol of the friendship between the two peoples. Leading the Edain to their new home was Elros, the twin brother of Elrond. Both were half elven, the sons of Eärendil, and the Vala had given them a choice: to be counted among elvenkind and live forever in the undying lands, or to embrace the fate of men and live mortal lives, however long. Elrond chose to be elven. Elros chose to be a man, and he became the first king of Númenor, taking the name Tar Minyatur, which means First Lord. The Edain who followed him to Númenor became known as the Dúnedain, the men of the West, and they were blessed beyond all other peoples of mortal kind. The gifts bestowed upon the Dúnedain were extraordinary. They were taller than other men, typically standing over 6 feet, with some reaching nearly 7 feet in height. They were stronger, their bodies slow to weaken with age. They possessed a nobility of bearing that set them apart, a presence that commanded respect without words. Most remarkably, they were granted lifespans far beyond those of common men. Where others might live to 70 years if fortunate, the Númenóreans regularly lived to 200, sometimes 300 years, and the line of kings lived longer still. Elros himself ruled for 410 years before he chose to lay down his life, still hale and strong, feeling in his wisdom that his time had come. But the greatest gift was wisdom. The Dúnedain possessed keen minds and deep understanding. They became master craftsmen, building ships the likes of which the world had never seen. Ships that could brave any storm and sail to the furthest reaches of the ocean. They became expert in all manner of crafts: smithing, stonemasonry, farming, scholarship, the healing arts, warfare. The elves of Tol Eressëa, the island just off the coast of the Undying Lands, visited Númenor often, bringing gifts of trees and flowers that grew nowhere else in Middle-earth, teaching the Númenóreans their languages and lore, maintaining the friendship that had been forged in the fires of war. For centuries, Númenor flourished. Its capital, Armanelos, became a city of white towers and tree-lined streets, filled with libraries and workshops, gardens and temples. Its people lived in peace and plenty, exploring the world in their ships, mapping distant shores, bringing knowledge and aid to the lesser men of Middle-earth, who still lived in the shadow of Morgoth's long tyranny. The Númenóreans established havens and ports along the coasts of Middle-earth: Pelargir, Umbar, Lond Daer. They taught the native peoples agriculture and stonework, and the forging of metal. They were received as saviors, as gods walking among mortals. But there was a prohibition, one law that the Valar had established when they made their gift. The Númenóreans were forbidden from sailing west, forbidden from seeking the Undying Lands. That realm was not for mortal men, and to trespass there would bring disaster. For long years the Númenóreans accepted this. The ban, as it was called, was not resented. They had so much, why would they need more? Yet as centuries passed and the years accumulated, a shadow crept into the hearts of the Númenóreans. They saw their elven friends remain unchanged while they themselves grew old and died, no matter how long their lives. They began to fear death, to resent the gift of mortality that seemed more like a curse. Why should they die when the elves lived forever? Why were they kept from the Undying Lands when their lives were so short? The ban began to seem less like a necessary boundary and more like a cruel joke, a reminder of their inferiority. This discontent split the Númenóreans into two factions. The faithful remained true to the Valar and the elves, accepting their mortality as part of the design of creation, seeing death not as an end, but as a gift that freed them from the weariness of the world. But the king's men, who came to dominate the royal court and much of Númenor, grew bitter and proud. They began to resent the elves, to avoid the elven visitors, to speak against the Valar themselves. And into this discontent came Sauron, the Dark Lord, the greatest servant of Morgoth, who had survived his master's defeat. Sauron was subtle and patient. He allowed himself to be captured by the Númenorian king Ar-Pharazôn, brought back to the island in chains like a prize of war. But Sauron's greatest weapon was not his strength, but his words. In the king's court, he whispered lies wrapped in truth. He suggested that the Valar were hoarding immortality out of jealousy, that men could claim it by force, that death itself could be overcome if only they had the courage to reach out and take what was rightfully theirs. The king's men listened. They abandoned the worship of Eru Ilúvatar, the one god above all, and began to worship Morgoth, calling him the giver of freedom. They built a temple where human sacrifices were made, burning the faithful alive on its altars. They cut down Nimloth, the white tree that had been a symbol of their connection to the elves and the Valar. Though Isildur, a young man of the faithful, managed to save a fruit from the tree before it was felled, the act itself represented the complete corruption of Númenor's soul. Finally, Ar-Pharazôn, grown old and desperate to escape death, did the unthinkable. He assembled the greatest armada ever seen, a fleet so vast that its sails darkened the horizon, and he sailed west. He was going to land on the shores of the Undying Lands themselves, to storm the realm of the Valar and demand immortality at sword point. It was an act of madness, of pride so immense it defied comprehension. When Ar-Pharazôn's feet touched the beach of the Blessed Realm, the Valar laid down their guardianship of the world. They would not fight against the children of Ilúvatar, would not raise their hands against the beings they were meant to shepherd. Instead, they called upon Eru Ilúvatar himself, and God answered. The world was remade in that moment. The Undying Lands were removed from the circles of the world entirely, placed beyond reach in some dimension that mortal sailing could never find. The earth itself, which had been flat, was made round, and the straight road to the west was closed forever. And Númenor? Númenor was destroyed. A great wave rose up, taller than its highest mountain, and washed the entire island beneath the sea. Ar-Pharazôn and his army were buried under falling hills. The white towers of Armenelos crumbled and sank. The libraries burned. The gardens were torn apart. In a single night of terror and cataclysm, the greatest civilization of men was utterly annihilated. Millions died. The very shape of the world was changed, and of all the Númenóreans, only a handful survived. These survivors were the faithful, led by Elendil the Tall, whose name means elf friend, and his sons Isildur and Anarion. They had prepared for this day, maintaining ships in readiness, knowing in their hearts that Sauron's corruption would lead to disaster. When the great wave came, 9 ships fled the cataclysm, carrying perhaps a few thousand survivors and whatever treasures they could snatch from the doomed island. Isildur brought the fruit of the white tree. They brought the Palantiri, the seeing stones that allowed sight across vast distances. They brought their swords and their knowledge and their grief. When the faithful landed on the shores of Middle-earth, they were changed. The destruction of their homeland had broken something in them, had taught them the price of pride and the weight of loss. They would never again be the carefree explorers who had first sailed to these shores. They were exiles now, refugees from a sunken land, keepers of a memory that would grow dimmer with each passing generation. But they were not broken. Elendil and his sons established two kingdoms in Middle-earth, Arnor in the north, where Elendil made his seat, and Gondor in the south, jointly ruled by Isildur and Anarion. These were the realms in exile, kingdoms founded by survivors, built by those who had seen everything they knew destroyed and chose to begin again. Arnor was established in the region called Eriador, the land between the Misty Mountains and the Blue Mountains far to the west. Its capital was Anuminas, built on the shores of Lake Nenuel, a beautiful city of white stone that echoed the lost glory of Armenelos. From Anuminas, the kings of Arnor ruled over a broad realm that stretched from the Gulf of Lune in the west to the Weather Hills in the east, from the borders of the frozen north down to the lands that would one day become the Shire. The Dúnedain brought their gifts with them to Arnor. They built roads that lasted thousands of years. They raised watchtowers on high places like Amon Sul, Weathertop, where a palantir was kept so the king could see across his realm. They established Fornost Erain, the north gate of the kings, a great fortress city on the North Downs. They created a civilization in the wilderness, a realm where justice and learning flourished, where the old ways of Númenor were preserved and honored. For a time, Arnor was strong. Together with their brothers in Gondor, the Dúnedain of the north joined the last alliance of elves and men, marching to war against Sauron himself. That war would cost them dearly, but it would also forge a legend that would never die. For it was Isildur, son of Elendil, who cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand at the end of that conflict, winning victory, but also dooming himself and his descendants to carry a burden of immeasurable weight. But the high glory of Arnor did not last. The seeds of its dissolution were planted early, in decisions made in the aftermath of war and tragedy, and they would take centuries to bear their bitter fruit. This is the story of how a kingdom was broken into pieces, and how those pieces were ground to dust by a patient and malevolent enemy who understood that time itself could be a weapon. When Isildur cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand at the end of the Second Age, he should have destroyed it. The Elf Lord Elrond and the other leaders of the Alliance urged him to cast it into the fires of Mount Doom while they stood in its very shadow. But the ring had already begun to work its corruption on Isildur's heart. He kept it, claiming it as Wergild for the deaths of his father Elendil and his brother Anarion, both of whom had fallen in that final battle. He believed he could use its power, could master it, could bend it to his will in the service of good. He was wrong. 2 years later, Isildur was traveling north to take up his kingship in Arnor, accompanied by his 3 eldest sons and a small company of knights. They were ambushed at a place called the Gladden Fields by a host of orcs. The orcs should not have been a match for Númenorian warriors, but the ring betrayed Isildur. When he put it on to turn invisible and escape, the ring slipped from his finger in the waters of the river Anduin, and orcs' arrows found him, cutting him down in the shallows. His 3 eldest sons died trying to protect their father's body. Only his squire, carrying his youngest son Valandil, who had been left in Rivendell, survived to tell the tale. This disaster, known forever after as the disaster of the Gladden Fields, had profound consequences for both kingdoms of the Dúnedain. Isildur's death meant that his nephew Meneldyl, son of Anarion, became the sole ruler of Gondor, and that the kingship of Arnor fell to young Valandil, who was only 11 years old and safe in Rivendell when his father and brothers died. The 2 kingdoms, which had been unified under Elendil as High King, were now split. Meneldyl ruled Gondor, and though he nominally acknowledged Valandil's supremacy when the boy came of age, in practice, Gondor went its own way. The Dúnedain were now divided, and though they remained friendly and would aid each other in times of desperate need, they were no longer one people with one purpose. For nearly about 1,000 years, Arnor remained whole and strong under Valandil and his descendants. The kingdom prospered. The Dúnedain married and had children. Their population grew. The wild lands of Eriador were slowly tamed and cultivated. Towns grew up along the great roads. The Shire region in the west, though largely empty in these years, was peaceful and green. The Rangers, in these early years, were not desperate survivors clinging to existence, but rather proud scouts and woodsmen, guardians of civilization rather than keepers of its memory. But in the year 861 of the Third Age, King Eärendor, the 10th King of Arnor, died. He had 3 sons, and rather than having his realm pass intact to his eldest, as tradition demanded, those 3 sons quarrelled. The eldest, Amlaeth, claimed his father's throne and the title of High King, but his brothers would not bow to him. Each wanted to be a king in his own right, and each had supporters among the nobility who saw advantage in a division of power. So Arnor was split into 3 kingdoms. Amlaeth kept the western lands and established his capital at Fornost, calling his realm Arthedain. His brother established the kingdom of Cardolan in the south, centered on the lands around the Barrow Downs and the Old Forest. The third brother took the eastern lands around the Weather Hills and Weathertop, calling his kingdom Rhudaur. All 3 claimed to be the rightful heirs of Arnor's glory, and all 3 were weaker for their division. This fracturing had immediate consequences. The Palantir at Weathertop became a point of contention, with both Cardolan and Rhudaur claiming rights to it, though it remained in Arthedain's keeping. The great roads fell into disrepair in places where they crossed between kingdoms, as none of the 3 wanted to maintain infrastructure that would primarily benefit their rivals. The population of Dúnedain, once unified, now identified themselves first by their kingdom rather than their common heritage. But the worst consequence was strategic. A divided Arnor was vulnerable in ways that a united kingdom had never been. And in the mountains to the north, ancient evil was stirring, and it recognized opportunity when it saw it. Around the year 1300 of the Third Age, a realm was established in the frozen lands north of Eriador, in a valley nestled in the mountains. It was called Angmar, which means Iron Home, and it was ruled by a figure known only as the Witch King. The Witch King was no mortal man, though he had been one once, long ago. He was one of the Nazgûl, the Ringwraiths, the 9 kings of men whom Sauron had corrupted in the Second Age by giving them rings of power. They had become his most terrible servants, immortal but enslaved, powerful in sorcery but empty of everything that made them human. The Lord of the Nazgûl, the mightiest of the 9, had been sent by Sauron to destroy Arnor. Sauron, though diminished and hiding in the east, had not forgotten the Dúnedain who had overthrown him. He wanted revenge, wanted to snuff out the last light of Númenor in Middle-earth, and the Witch King was the perfect tool for this task, patient and cruel, and utterly without mercy. The Witch King built his power slowly. He gathered orcs from the mountains, trolls from the high places, men from the wild hill tribes who had never loved the Dúnedain and their civilized ways. he fortified the city of Khan deep in his mountain realm. He sent spies into Eriador, sowing discord, spreading fear, and he waited, watched, planned. His first target was Rhudaur, the weakest of the three kingdoms. Rhudaur had the fewest Dúnedain of pure blood, its population being heavily mixed with the native peoples of the region. Its kings came to be dominated by hillmen who owed no loyalty to the memory of Númenor. Around the year 1400, the line of Isildur failed completely in Rhudaur, and a hillman chieftain claimed the throne. This new king looked north to Angmar, saw power, and bent his knee to the Witch King. Rhudaur became, in effect, a vassal state of Angmar. Its armies were put at the Witch King's disposal. Its borders were open to all control raiders, and when the Witch King was ready to make his move against the other kingdoms, Rhudaur's forces would strike alongside his own. That attack came in the year 1409, and it was devastating. The Witch King, commanding armies of orcs and hillmen, swept down from the north. His forces fell upon the tower of Amon Sul, where the Palantir was kept, defended by King Arvaleg I of Arthedain. The battle was fierce and desperate, but the defenders were outnumbered. Arvaleg himself fell, cut down defending his post. Though his son managed to escape with the Palantir, the tower was taken and burned. Its ruins would stand for all the ages to come, a broken reminder of that dark day. Cardolan, caught unprepared, faced invasion from both the north and the east as Angmar's forces spread across Eriador. The kingdom's heartland, the region around the Barrow Downs, became a battlefield. The Dúnedain of Cardolan fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed. Refugees fled west toward Arthedain, carrying what they could save. The last prince of Cardolan died in that invasion, and though the kingdom would technically survive in a diminished form for a few more centuries, it never truly recovered. Arthedain, under its new king Arvaleg's son, Arafor, managed to hold. Reinforcements arrived from the elves of Lindon to the west, and from the elves of Lothlorien far to the east, for the elves had not forgotten their alliance with the Dúnedain. These elven forces helped drive the Witch King's armies back, saving Arthedain from complete destruction. But the cost was enormous. The population of Dúnedain, already divided, was now devastated. Thousands had died. Thousands more had fled to safer lands in the west. And the lands, east of the Great Road, once populated and cultivated, were now dangerous wilderness once more. For the next few centuries, there was an uneasy stalemate. Arthedain held the line, its borders constantly harassed by orc raids and worse, but never quite breaking. Cardolan survived as a vassal kingdom of Arthedain, but it was a shadow of its former self, its population dwindling. Angmar, bloodied by the intervention of the elves and unable to achieve total victory, remained in its northern fastness, biding its time. Then, in the year 1636, catastrophe struck from an unexpected quarter. A plague came out of the east, a disease so terrible that it became known as the Great Plague. It swept across Middle-earth like fire, killing vast numbers everywhere it touched. But it struck hardest in the north, in what remained of Arnor. The plague ravaged the already weakened Dúnedain, killing far more of them than any war had done. In Cardolan, the plague was an extinction event. The last of the Dúnedain of that kingdom died, leaving behind empty villages and abandoned farms. The royal line ended. The Barrow Downs, which had been the burial mounds of Cardolan's princes, became haunted places as the Witch King sent evil spirits called Barrow-wights to inhabit the tombs, turning them into traps for any who wandered there. An entire kingdom simply ceased to exist, its people dead, its lands empty, save for the lingering evil the Witch King had planted there. Dúnedain survived, but just barely. Its population was gutted. Entire families died, leaving no heirs. The old towns along the Great Road were abandoned, their inhabitants dead or fled. King Argaleb II, who had tried to maintain some semblance of control over all the old territories of Arnor, found himself ruling over a kingdom that was more empty land than living people. Yet the Dúnedain endured. They were fewer, weaker, but they held. They maintained their watch on the borders. They rebuilt what they could. They remembered who they were and what they were meant to defend. And in Rivendell, Elrond Half-Elven kept safe the heirlooms of the House of Isildur, the shards of the sword Narsil, which had cut the ring from Sauron's hand, the Elendilmir, the Star of the North, the Ring of Barahir, passed down from the First Age, and the Scepter of Anuminas, symbol of royal authority. These treasures were held in trust, waiting for the day when a king might return to claim them. But that day seemed impossibly distant, because in the year 1974, after centuries of patient waiting, the Witch King made his final move. The winter of that year was brutal, the worst in living memory. Snow fell early and deep. The cold was merciless. And out of that killing winter came the armies of Angmar, larger and more terrible than any force the Witch King had yet unleashed. Orcs and trolls marched alongside hillmen and corrupted men from the east. Fell creatures of shadow walked among them. The Witch King himself led from the front, a figure of terror clothed in black, his very presence draining hope from those who stood against him. Arthedain's defenders fought with desperate courage, but they were too few, too exhausted, too weakened by centuries of war and plague. The outer fortresses fell one by one. The borders collapsed. And then the Witch King's forces stood before Fornost itself, the last great city of the Dúnedain in the north. Fornost's walls were strong, built by the ancient craft of Númenor, and its defenders were the last remnants of the kingdom's military strength. They held for weeks, then months, through that terrible winter. But in the end, numbers and dark sorcery prevailed. The walls were breached. The Witch King's forces poured into the city. King Arvedui, the last king of Arthedain and the last king of Arnor, was forced to flee with a few loyal followers. Arvedui ran north, into the frozen wastes beyond the settled lands, hoping to find shelter and perhaps a ship to carry him to safety. He found temporary refuge among the Lossoth, the snowmen of the far north. But when a ship finally came from Gondor to rescue him, disaster struck one last time. The ship, attempting to navigate the ice-choked waters, was caught in a storm and wrecked against the ice. It broke apart and sank, taking with it Arvedui and the 2 Palantiri he had managed to save. The last king of Arnor died in the frozen sea, and with him the kingdom ended. The Dúnedain were broken. Their kingdom was gone. Their cities were ruins. Their numbers were reduced to perhaps a few thousand souls scattered across Eriador. But they were not destroyed. Not quite. Because even in defeat, even in the depths of their catastrophe, the heirs of Númenor chose not to surrender. They chose to endure. And so they became something new. They became rangers. They became the wanderers, the guardians in the shadows. the keepers of a trust that no one else even remembered. They became the last memory of Arnor, walking its empty roads and watching over its abandoned places, waiting for a day that might never come. In the aftermath of Arnor's fall, in those dark days when the last cities lay in ruins and the Witch King sat in triumph in the halls of Fornost, the surviving Dúnedain faced a choice. They could abandon their homeland entirely, flee south to Gondor where their distant cousins still maintained a kingdom. They could settle in Bree or the other western villages and become farmers and merchants, letting their noble heritage fade into comfortable obscurity. Or they could refuse to yield, refuse to forget, refuse to let the darkness have the final word. They chose the hardest path. They chose to remain. Aranarth, the son of the drowned king Arvedui, was 21 years old when his father died. By every right, he should have been crowned king, should have taken the Elendilmere and the scepter and claimed his inheritance. But what would he be king of? Empty ruins, scattered refugees. A kingdom existed in name and memory, but not in fact. To declare himself king would have been an empty gesture, a hollow title for a realm that no longer existed. So Aranarth made a different choice, one that would define his people for 1,000 years. He claimed the title of chieftain of the Dúnedain. Not king, for there was no kingdom to rule, but chieftain, leader of a people, guardian of a bloodline, keeper of a hope. He would not rule from a throne in a palace, but rather live among his people in the wilderness, sharing their hardships, leading by example rather than by royal decree. This decision was not just practical, but deeply symbolic. It acknowledged the reality of their situation while refusing to surrender their identity. The Dúnedain had fallen from the heights of power, but they chose not to fall into despair. They would adapt, survive, endure, and they would wait, maintaining the line of succession, preserving the ancient ways, keeping alive the possibility that one day, somehow, a kingdom might be restored. The first order of business was simple survival. The Dúnedain, who had escaped Fornost's fall, were scattered across Eriador, hiding in forests and remote valleys, hunted by the Witch King's forces that now roamed freely across what had been Arnor's heartland. They needed a place to gather, to regroup, to make a stand if necessary. That place would be called the Angle. The Angle was a wedge of land formed by the joining of two rivers, the Horwell and the Loudwater, in the lands south of Rivendell. It was protected by water on two sides and by the thick forests of the Trollshaws on the third. It was remote, difficult to reach, and easily defended by a small force against a much larger enemy. Most importantly, it was within the sphere of protection offered by Rivendell, and Elrond half-elven had made clear that the Dúnedain would always be welcome in his realm and under his protection. Here, in the Angle, the Dúnedain established what passed for their capital. It was not a city, not even a large town. It was a settlement of wooden houses and crude fortifications, a place where families could gather in relative safety, where children could be raised, where the skills and knowledge of Númenor could be passed down to the next generation. It was, in every sense, a reduction from what they had been. But it was home, and it was theirs, and no enemy had taken it from them. The transformation from kingdom to tribe was profound. The Dúnedain, who had been lords and ladies, who had lived in stone houses with servants, now found themselves living in huts and hunting for their food. The knights, who had ridden to war in armor and mounted on fine horses, now travelled on foot or on rough-coated ponies, wearing leather and homespun cloth. The scholars who had studied in libraries now taught their children by firelight, preserving what knowledge they could in memory rather than in books. But some things did not change. The Dúnedain remained the descendants of Númenor, and that heritage showed itself in undeniable ways. They were still taller than common men, their bearing still noble, their minds still sharp. Most remarkably, they retained much of their ancient longevity. Where other men might live to 60 or 70 years, the Dúnedain could expect to reach 150 or more, and the chieftains, who carried the purest blood of Númenor, often lived to 200. This longevity was both a blessing and a burden. It meant that Aranarth, who became chieftain in 1906, would live to see his great-great-grandchildren. It meant that the memory of Arnor's glory, the memory of what had been lost, remained fresh and sharp for longer than would have been natural. It meant that the Dúnedain could not simply forget and move on, could not let time soften the edges of their grief. They were forced to carry their loss with them, generation after generation, a people living in the shadow of a past they could never quite escape. The relationship between the Dúnedain and Rivendell became the cornerstone of their survival. Elrond, who was himself descended from the same royal lines as the Dúnedain, who had been the herald of Elendil himself, who had witnessed the forging of Arnor and its long decline, took the remnant of that kingdom under his particular protection. He offered sanctuary to any who needed it. He provided counsel to the chieftains. Most importantly, he kept safe the heirlooms of the House of Isildur. But Elrond did more than simply safeguard ancient treasures. He also safeguarded the future. A tradition was established that each chieftain's son, when he was born, would be brought to Rivendell as an infant and raised there in secret until he came of age. This was partly for safety, keeping the heir protected in Elrond's hidden valley, where no orc or agent of the enemy could easily reach. But it was also to give each heir and more education that the Angle could not provide, to ensure that he learned the languages and lore of the elves, the history of his people, the responsibilities that came with his bloodline. Each young heir grew up in Rivendell not knowing his true identity, raised alongside the elves, learning to read and write in multiple languages, studying maps and histories, training in combat and woodcraft. Only when he reached manhood, typically around age 20, would Elrond reveal the truth, that he was the heir of Isildur, the chieftain-to-be, descended from Elendil and Númenor, bearer of a duty that stretched back thousands of years. It was then that he would be given the Ring of Barahir, the ancient heirloom, and shown the shards of Narsil, the sword that had defeated Sauron, waiting to be reforged. This revelation must have been both glorious and terrible. Glorious, to discover that you were part of such a lineage, that you carried in your veins the blood of the great kings. Terrible, to realize that you were also inheriting a duty that had broken your forebears, that you were being asked to lead a dwindling people with no kingdom, no power, no hope of victory, only the grim determination to hold the line against the darkness for as long as strength lasted. The young men who learned their true names in Rivendell would then leave that haven and go out into the wild, taking up the mantle of ranger, beginning the long years of service that would define their lives. Some would eventually become chieftain, leading their people. Others would die before that day came, killed by orcs or wolves or trolls or worse. but all of them, from the moment they learned who they were, carried the weight of memory and duty. The word ranger itself tells us something about what these men became. They were rangers in the old sense of the word, those who range far and wide, who patrol vast territories, who watch and guard without settlement or fixed post. They were scouts and trackers, hunters and warriors, living rough in all weathers, sleeping in thickets or abandoned ruins, eating whatever they could forage or hunt, moving constantly through the wilderness of Eriador. But they were also rangers in a deeper sense. They ranged between worlds, between the civilized and the wild, between the past and the present, between hope and despair. They were men who had been kings, but chose to be guardians. Men who had owned palaces, but now claimed only the clothes on their backs and the swords in their hands. Men who walked through villages where they were feared and distrusted, called rangers as if it were an insult, knowing all the while that they were the only thing standing between those villages and the darkness that would swallow them. The people of Bree, the largest village in Eriador, viewed the rangers with deep suspicion. These grim, weathered men who appeared without warning, who spoke little, who had eyes that seemed to see too much. They were unsettling. They dressed in dark grey or green, wore travel-stained cloaks, carried long swords and bows. They looked, to be honest, like brigands. The folk of Bree did not know that these dangerous wanderers were descended from the highest nobility, that they were the last remnant of a kingdom that had once ruled all these lands. They only knew that rangers brought news of wolves and orcs, of trouble in the wild places, and that seemed to follow them wherever they went. Some rangers tried to maintain a connection to their heritage by wearing a silver brooch shaped like a seven-pointed star, the symbol of Elendil and the North Kingdom. But most kept their identity hidden, finding it easier to work without the complications that came with revealing who they truly were. They became shadows, rumors, figures glimpsed at the edge of firelight, or passing silently through the woods. They were the mysterious strangers in the corner of the inn, the unseen guardians on the empty roads, the warning before danger struck. But among themselves, in the angle and in their scattered camps, the Dúnedain maintained their culture and their pride. They spoke Sindarin, the Elvish tongue, as often as they spoke the common speech. They taught their children the names and deeds of their ancestors, the stories of Númenor and Elendil, Isildur and the Last Alliance. They kept alive the memory of Arnor, of Anuminus and Fornost and Weathertop in their glory days. They sang old songs and recited genealogies, ensuring that each new generation knew exactly who they were and what they represented. This was crucial because without kingdoms or cities, without written records widely kept, the only way to preserve their identity was through oral tradition and the strength of their community bonds. If the Dúnedain had let go of their past, they would have simply dissolved into the general population of Eriador within a few generations. But they held on, fiercely, stubbornly, refusing to let their heritage die. And they held on to something else as well, the royal line itself. Despite all their losses, despite being reduced to a wandering people living in the wild, the Dúnedain never lost track of their lineage. They knew exactly who was descended from whom, all the way back through the centuries to Isildur. They preserved this knowledge with absolute precision, because the line of succession mattered. It was their claim to legitimacy, their proof that they were not just random survivors, but the rightful heirs of Arnor. One day, they believed, one day a king would arise again. And when that day came, the line had to be intact, unbroken, ready. This preservation of the bloodline was not just symbolic, it was practical. The heirs of Isildur possessed certain traits that set them apart. Greater longevity, greater wisdom, a quality of leadership that was almost supernatural in its effectiveness. These gifts were concentrated in the direct line from Isildur, and maintaining that line meant maintaining access to those gifts. It meant that when the Dúnedain followed their chieftain, they were following someone who genuinely was more than ordinary, someone whose very blood gave him advantages that justified his authority. In the year 1975, just a year after Fornos fell, one final confrontation occurred between the forces of Angmar and the Free Peoples. Prince Eärnur of Gondor arrived from the south with a great host, having sailed north to aid Arthedain, only to find he was too late. But though he could not save the kingdom, he could still take revenge. Together with forces from Lindon, led by Círdan the Shipwright, and from Rivendell, led by the mighty elf lord Glorfindel, Eärnur's army marched against the Witch King. The Battle of Fornost was fought on the plains north of the ruined city. The Witch King, overconfident in his recent victory, came out to meet the allied army in the open. It was a mistake. The forces of Gondor and the elves were far stronger than the remnants of Arthedain had been. They fell upon the Witch King's army and shattered it. When the enemy tried to flee back to Angmar, cavalry from Gondor circled around and cut them off. The Witch King himself barely escaped, fleeing on a black horse with Eärnur in pursuit. But before Eärnur could overtake him, Glorfindel intervened. The ancient elf lord, who had fought Balrogs in the First Age, warned Eärnur to let the Witch King go, and he spoke a prophecy that would echo down through the ages. Do not pursue him. He will not return to this land. Far off yet is his doom, and not by the hand of man will he fall. The Witch King vanished into the northern wastes. His kingdom of Angmar collapsed without him, but he was not destroyed, merely defeated. He would return, in time, in the service of his master Sauron. But for now, the north was free of his shadow. For the Dúnedain, this was a victory, but a hollow one. Angmar was defeated, yes, but Arnor was still gone. The Dúnedain were still homeless wanderers. Nothing had been restored. The only difference was that they could now range more freely through Eriador, without constant fear of organized attack. It was the difference between desperate survival and mere survival. An improvement, perhaps, but not a solution. And so they continued. Generation after generation, the Rangers walked the empty lands of their fathers, keeping watch, keeping faith, keeping the memory alive. They were the bridge between a glorious past and an uncertain future. Men living in an eternal present of duty and sacrifice, waiting for a tomorrow that might never come. But to understand the Rangers fully, we must look beyond the grand sweep of their history and examine the texture of their daily existence. What did it mean, in practical terms, to be a ranger? How did they survive year after year in the wilderness? What skills sustained them? And when they returned to the Angle, that small settlement between them, rivers that served as their only home, what kind of life awaited them there? A ranger's survival depended on mastering a constellation of skills that few other men possessed. Tracking was perhaps the most fundamental. A ranger could read the wilderness like a scholar reads a book, finding meaning in signs that would be invisible to untrained eyes. A bent blade of grass, nearly recovered to its natural position, told him that someone had passed this way within the last few hours. The depth and spacing of footprints revealed not just what made them, but how fast it was moving and whether it carried a burden. A disturbance in the leaf litter, barely noticeable, might indicate where a creature had bedded down for the night. But tracking was more than just following obvious trails. It was understanding behavior, predicting movement, thinking like the quarry. A ranger tracking orcs would know that they preferred to travel at night, that they avoided open ground when possible, that they would seek water sources. He would know the routes they typically use through the mountains, the places they might camp, the ways they would try to hide their passage. This knowledge, accumulated over decades of experience, turned tracking from a mechanical skill into something closer to intuition. Woodcraft went hand in hand with tracking. Rangers moved through forests and wild lands with a silence and efficiency that bordered on supernatural. They knew how to place their feet to avoid snapping twigs, how to use natural cover to remain unseen, how to move with the wind rather than against it, so their scent would not betray them. They could stand motionless in the shadows beneath trees and simply vanish from sight, not through magic, but through an understanding of light and shadow and the way human eyes perceive movement. They knew plants in intimate detail, not just their names but their uses. Which roots could be eaten raw, which needed to be cooked, which were poisonous, which leaves could be brewed into tea that would help with fever or ease pain, which barks could be stripped and used to treat wounds, preventing infection and promoting healing, which berries were safe in which seasons, and which looked edible but would make you violently ill. This knowledge kept them alive when food was scarce and saved their lives when they were injured far from any healer. Water finding was another essential skill. A ranger could read the landscape and know where springs were likely to be found, could follow the flight patterns of birds to locate water sources, could dig in certain types of soil and find moisture even in dry seasons. They carried water skins, but they also knew they could go nowhere without knowing where the next water could be found. Firecraft was equally important, though rangers used fire sparingly, knowing that smoke and light could betray their position. But when fire was needed, they could make it in conditions that would defeat most men. They could start fires in rain, could find dry tinder in the wettest forests, could create small, efficient fires that produce maximum heat with minimum smoke. They knew how to bank fires so they would smolder through the night without tending, and how to extinguish them completely so no trace remained. Their combat skills were honed through constant practice and, unfortunately, frequent use. Rangers were deadly with the bow, able to shoot accurately at ranges that would impress even elven archers. They practiced constantly, shooting at marks until they could hit a target the size of an apple at 100 paces. But they also trained to shoot quickly, to loose multiple arrows in rapid succession, to shoot from awkward positions and while moving. In combat, a ranger might have only seconds to identify a threat, draw, aim, and loose before the enemy closed to melee range. With the sword, rangers favored efficiency over showmanship. Their fighting style was economical, focused on defense and counterattack rather than aggressive assault. They fought to survive and to kill quickly, not to display skill. A ranger would rather strike from ambush and end a fight before it truly began than engage in a prolonged duel. When forced into open combat, they used every advantage: terrain, surprise, the enemy's expectations. They were not above throwing dirt in an orc's eyes or kicking out its knee if it meant winning the fight and living to see another dawn. But perhaps most important was their ability to endure. Rangers developed a physical and mental toughness that allowed them to continue functioning under conditions that would break ordinary men. They could march 20 or 30 miles in a day carrying full gear, then stand watch through half the night. They could go days with minimal food, weeks eating nothing but what they could forage or hunt. They could sleep on the cold ground in freezing rain and wake up ready to fight. This endurance was not natural. It was earned through years of hardship, through pushing themselves past what they thought they could endure and discovering they could endure more. The mental discipline was just as important as the physical. Rangers spent long periods alone, going weeks or months without seeing another friendly face. The solitude could drive men mad if they were not prepared for it. Rangers learned to be comfortable with their own thoughts, to find peace in silence, to not need constant companionship or conversation. But they also learned to stay alert, to not let isolation dull their senses or their purpose. It was a delicate balance, being alone without becoming lonely, being self-sufficient without becoming detached from the people they protected. When Rangers did return to the Angle, they found something that barely resembled civilization, but was precious nonetheless. The settlement was not impressive by any standard. There were no stone buildings, no great halls, no fortifications beyond a wooden palisade that was more symbolic than defensive. The houses were simple structures of wood and thatch, clustered along the riverbank, surrounded by small gardens where families grew vegetables and herbs. But it was home. In the Angle, Rangers could set down their packs, sleep in actual beds, eat hot meals prepared by others. They could bathe properly, washing away the accumulated grime of weeks or months in the wild. They could have their gear repaired by skilled craftsmen, have their clothes mended, have their wounds tended by healers who had the time and resources to do a proper job, rather than the field medicine Rangers performed on themselves. The women of the Dúnedain, largely absent from the tales of ranging and battle, were the backbone of the Angle's existence. They maintained the settlement, grew food, raised children, kept the traditions and stories alive. Many were the wives and mothers of Rangers, living with the constant fear that their husbands and sons would not return from patrol. They were strong in their own way, bearing a different but equally heavy burden. They preserved the domestic arts that the Rangers, in their wandering life, had largely lost: weaving, cooking, herbalism of the gentler kind, the raising of children in something approaching normalcy. Children in the Angle grew up in a unique environment, caught between two worlds. They lived in a settled community, but from their earliest years, they knew that many of them, especially the boys, would eventually leave to become Rangers. They were taught to track and hunt, to move quietly, to recognize the signs of danger. But they were also taught the stories of their people, the genealogy stretching back to Númenor, the songs in Sindarin, the old customs that marked them as Dúnedain. The training of young Rangers began early. Boys of 10 or 12 would accompany their fathers or older brothers on short patrols, learning by observation and practice. By 15 or 16, they were going on longer trips, taking on more responsibility. By 20, they were full Rangers, capable of operating independently. It was an apprenticeship system, knowledge passed directly from one generation to the next, refined by experience and necessity. Family life for the Dúnedain was complicated by the demands of their calling. Rangers who married often saw their families only a few times a year, spending the majority of their time ranging. This created strain, but it also created fierce appreciation for the time they did have together. When a ranger returned to the angle, he cherished every moment with his wife and children, knowing it might be months before he saw them again. The angle also served as a place of healing and recovery. Rangers injured too badly to continue immediately would convalesce there, tended by healers and their families. Old rangers, those who had finally become too worn down by years of service to continue ranging, would retire to the angle, spending their final years teaching the young, maintaining equipment, contributing what they could to the community's survival. There were celebrations in the angle, though they were infrequent. When rangers gathered, particularly during the winter months when ranging was most difficult, there would be feasts such as their limited resources allowed. They would sing the old songs, recite the genealogies, tell stories of ancient glory and recent deeds. These gatherings reinforced their identity, reminded them who they were and why they endured. They were not just survivors scratching out an existence. They were the Dúnedain, heirs of kings, and they would not forget. Yet even in the angle, even in their closest approximation to normal life, the Rangers remained apart from the rest of the world. They spoke Sindarin among themselves, maintained customs that would have seemed strange to the folk of Bree or the Shire. They lived always with the knowledge that they were the last remnant of something that had once been great, that they were preserving a heritage that most of the world had forgotten or never knew existed. The angle was also where the heirlooms and treasures of the Dúnedain were kept, those few items not entrusted to Rivendell. Family swords passed down through generations, silver brooches bearing the star of Elendil, rings and pendants that had been worn by the nobility of Arnor. These were not valuable in terms of gold or jewels, but they were priceless as links to the past, tangible connections to ancestors and glory days. This, then, was the reality of Ranger life. Months of lonely hardship in the wilderness, punctuated by brief returns to a simple settlement that was home only because there was nowhere else to go. It was a life of constant sacrifice, of skills maintained through endless practice, of endurance tested every day. They owned almost nothing, lived with almost no comfort, and died far younger than their blood should have allowed. But they held on to their pride, their identity, their purpose. They were Rangers, they were Dúnedain, and that meant something even when the rest of the world had forgotten what it meant. But the Rangers did not patrol Eriador for their own benefit. They had no lands to protect, no property to defend. What they guarded was everyone else's peace and safety. The villages, the farms, the travellers on the roads, the hobbits in the Shire, all of these people who knew nothing of the true danger that surrounded them, who lived their comfortable lives unaware of the darkness beyond the edges of the firelight. These were the ones the Rangers protected. This was the true nobility of the Dúnedain in their diminished state. They chose to serve those who did not know they needed serving. They chose to guard people who neither asked for protection nor offered thanks for receiving it. They chose to fight enemies that the folk they protected believed did not exist. In a very real sense, the Rangers were the reason that ordinary people could afford to not believe in evil, because the Rangers fought it in the dark where no one had to see. Consider the Shire, that pleasant land of rolling green hills and comfortable hobbit holes where the most pressing concerns were the weather's effect on the crop and whether the neighbour had acquired the recipe for a particularly good mushroom pie. The hobbits lived in what can only be described as paradise. Peaceful, prosperous, utterly safe. They had no standing army, no fortifications, no guards on their borders beyond a handful of bounders who mostly worried about lost sheep and troublesome young hobbits sneaking out to poach rabbits. This safety was not accidental, nor was it the natural state of things. The Shire sat in the heart of what had been Arnor, surrounded on all sides by the ruins of that kingdom and the wild lands beyond. Orcs came down from the misty mountains. Wolves hunted in packs through the eastern wastes. Trolls lurked in the hills to the north. Worse things, darker things that had no names in the common speech, prowled the forgotten places. Any of these threats could have swept through the Shire and destroyed it utterly. The hobbits, unarmed and unprepared, would have been slaughtered. But none of these threats reached the Shire. Not in all the centuries after Arnor's fall did a single orc band make it through the borders into hobbit lands. Not one wolf pack, not one troll. This was not luck. This was the Rangers. The Dúnedain had appointed themselves the guardians of the Shire, though they never asked the hobbits' permission and never expected their gratitude. Indeed, most hobbits did not even know the Rangers existed. They simply lived in blissful ignorance, assuming that the world was naturally peaceful, that the worst threats they faced were harsh winters and occasional floods. If they thought about it at all, they might have assumed that Bree, the nearby village of men, offered some sort of protection. But Bree had no army either. Bree survived because the Rangers protected it too. The Rangers' method of protection was subtle and constant. They did not garrison forts on the Shire's borders or establish checkpoints on the roads. Instead, they ranged constantly through the lands around the Shire, moving through the wilderness in small groups or alone, watching and listening. When they caught word of orcs moving west from the mountains, the Rangers would intercept them in the wild, killing them silently in ambushes or running battles that the hobbits never heard about. When wolves began ranging too close to settled lands, the Rangers hunted them down. When unsavory men, brigands, bandits, agents of the enemy entered the region, the Rangers would track them, warn them off if possible, kill them if necessary. This was dangerous work. The Rangers were always vastly outnumbered. A patrol of 3 or 4 Rangers might find themselves facing 20 orcs. They relied on superior skill, better woodcraft, knowledge of the terrain, and the advantage of surprise. They fought at night, used the forest as an ally, struck hard and vanished before the enemy could organize a response. Many Rangers died this way, cut down by orc blades in the dark of the wild, their bodies never found, their deaths unmarked save in the memory of their companions. But they kept the watch anyway, because this was their duty, their self-appointed burden. They were the descendants of kings, and kings protected their people. It did not matter that the hobbits did not acknowledge them as kings, did not even acknowledge their existence. The duty remained. In the winter of the year 2747 of the Third Age, a particularly large band of orcs managed to slip through the Rangers' net. They came out of the misty mountains in greater numbers than usual, moving quickly, and made it all the way to the Shire's borders before the Rangers could intercept them. Some orcs actually crossed into the Shire itself, the first time in centuries that enemies had penetrated that far. The hobbits, faced with actual danger for the first time in their comfortable lives, might have simply cowered and been massacred. But the hobbits, for all their love of peace and plenty, were not cowards. They gathered under the leadership of a hobbit named Bandobras Tuk, called Bull Roarer for his enormous size and voice. the hobbits fought the orcs in open battle, and they actually won, killing the orc chieftain and driving the survivors back out of the Shire. This became the most famous event in Hobbit history, the Battle of Greenfields, celebrated in songs and stories. The hobbits were justifiably proud of their victory. What they did not know was that even as they fought that battle, Rangers were fighting a larger battle just outside the Shire's borders, engaging the main body of the orc force that would have overwhelmed the hobbits if it had gotten through. The Rangers destroyed that force, but at cost in lives and blood. The hobbits would never know. In their songs, they had defeated the orcs single-handed. The Rangers, as always, remained unmentioned, invisible, keeping their secret protection secret. That same winter was known as the Long Winter, and it was brutal. Snow fell from November through March. The food stores ran low. The Rangers, working with the wizard Gandalf, helped the Shire and other communities survive by organizing relief efforts, bringing supplies from the south, guiding travelers who would have gotten lost and frozen without their help. Again, they did this without acknowledgement. To the hobbits, it was just luck that supplies got through. They never knew about the Rangers who had cleared the roads of snow, who had fought off wolves that would have attacked the caravans, who had guided the relief wagons through blizzards. The people of Bree had a more complicated relationship with the Rangers. Unlike the hobbits, the Bree folk actually knew the Rangers existed. They saw them occasionally, grim weathered men who came to the inn for a hot meal or to deliver news from the wild lands. But the Bree folk did not trust the Rangers. They thought them dangerous, these strange wanderers with their swords and their silence. There were whispers that the Rangers were bandits, that they were the ones causing the very troubles they claimed to be fighting against. This mistrust was both ironic and sad. The Rangers were the greatest friends the Bree folk had, their unseen protectors, and yet they were viewed with suspicion and fear. But the Rangers did not try to change these attitudes. They accepted them as the price of their service. It was easier to let the Bree folk think them dangerous than to reveal the truth and have to explain the whole long history of Arnor and its fall and the royal line that still endured. Easier to remain mysterious than to risk the complications that would come with being known. The Rangers' protection extended far beyond the Shire and Bree, however. They ranged across all of Eriador, from the Shire in the west to the Misty Mountains in the east, from the far northern wastes down to the borders of what had been Cardolan. This was an enormous territory for a small band of men to patrol, and they could not be everywhere at once. But they prioritized, focusing their efforts on the most populated areas and the most traveled roads, while still maintaining some presence in the deep wilderness where evil things gathered. They watched the ruins of the ancient cities, foremost, overgrown and haunted, which the Bree folk called Deadman's Dyke, and avoided. Anuminas on the shore of Lake Nenuile, its white towers long since crumbled. The tower of Amon Sul on Weathertop, burned and broken, but still commanding a view of all the lands around. The Rangers knew that these places drew dark things, creatures that fed on ancient pain and old evil. They kept watch on them, ensuring that nothing too terrible emerged from those shadows. They watched the borders, especially the mountain passes where orcs came down from the heights. They knew the routes the enemy used, the valleys and paths. They set ambushes in these places, waiting with patience learned over lifetimes for the orcs to come, then striking with deadly efficiency. An orc band of 20 might venture into Eriador. 15 might reach the foothills. 10 might reach the borders of the wildlands. 5 might reach the edge of settled lands. None would reach the villages. This was the mathematics of the Rangers' protection, a steady attrition of the enemy's forces, death by 1,000 small engagements, never flashy, never celebrated, but utterly essential. They tracked individual threats as well. If a particularly dangerous troll established a lair too close to a travelled road, the Rangers would hunt it down. If a pack of wargs, the evil wolves used as mounts by orcs, began hunting in the area, the Rangers would track the pack and kill every last one. If strange men were seen, men with the look of the south or the east about them, men who might be spies for Mordor, the Rangers would follow them, learn their purpose, deal with them as necessary. This constant vigilance took a toll on the Rangers themselves. They lived hard lives, always travelling, always exposed to weather and danger. They slept rough more nights than not, curled in their cloaks under hedges or in thickets, waking at the slightest sound. They ate cold food most of the time, not daring to light fires that might give away their position. They went long periods without seeing friendly faces, alone in the wilderness with only their thoughts and their duty for company. And they died young, or at least younger than their Númenórean heritage would naturally allow. The chieftains, protected in Rivendell during their youth and less exposed to constant danger as leaders, still lived to 150 or even 200 years. But ordinary rangers, those who spent decade after decade ranging through the wild, fighting orcs and wolves and trolls, they often did not live past 80 or 90. Still longer than common men, yes, but far short of what their blood should have granted them. The wilderness consumed them, wore them down through accumulated small injuries, exposure, battles. It was a hard life, and it made for hard men. Yet they maintained their nobility of spirit. They did not become cruel or bitter, did not turn their swords to banditry or use their skills for selfish ends. They remained the Dúnedain, the men of the West, the heirs of Númenor. They held themselves to the standards of their ancestors, even when no one was watching, even when it would have been so easy to let those standards slip. This inner strength, this refusal to be corrupted by hardship, may have been their greatest achievement. They lost their kingdom, their wealth, their recognition, but they kept their honor intact. The relationship between the Rangers and other free peoples of Middle-earth was complex. The elves of Lindon and Rivendell knew who the Rangers truly were and respected them deeply. When Rangers passed through elven lands, they were greeted as friends and honored guests. The elves saw in them the best of men, courage, nobility, faithfulness to duty, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. To the elves, the Rangers represented the reason that the long alliance between elves and men had been worth maintaining. The dwarves, practical and focused on their own affairs, had little interaction with the Rangers, but respected their fighting prowess when they encountered them. The Rangers and dwarves occasionally fought as allies against common enemies like orcs, and in these battles, mutual respect was earned through shared blood and victory. But to the common people of Eriador, to the farmers and villagers and travellers, the Rangers remained mysterious and somewhat frightening. They were valued for the news they brought, for the warnings they delivered about danger on the roads, but they were not loved. They were too grim, too weathered, too different. They did not fit into normal society. They stood at the edges of the firelight rather than sitting beside it, and this made people nervous. The Rangers accepted this separation. They knew that they were not like other men anymore, that centuries of living in the wild had changed them, had made them into something apart. They were comfortable in the wilderness in ways that normal people could never be. They could read tracks that others could not see, sense danger that others could not feel, move through terrain that would defeat ordinary travelers. These skills created a gap between them and common folk, a gap that could not be easily bridged. But underneath this acceptance was a deep loneliness. The Rangers were few, perhaps never more than a few hundred at any one time, scattered across a vast territory. They often worked alone or in small groups, going months without seeing another of their kind. They could not form normal relationships with the people they protected, could not settle down and raise families in the villages they guarded. Most Rangers never married, never had children. Those who did faced the agonizing choice of whether to raise their children in the wild or send them away to be raised by others in safer lands. This loneliness was the price of their service. They had chosen, or had been born into a people who had chosen, to stand between civilization and chaos, between light and darkness, between memory and forgetting. And that position, by its very nature, meant standing apart, standing alone, standing watch while others slept safely in their beds. Through it all, the Rangers maintained their secret pride. They knew who they were, even if no one else did. They were the sons of kings, the heirs of Númenor, the descendants of men who had walked with elves and fought beside them against the very embodiment of evil. They carried in their veins the blood of Elros half-elven, who had chosen mortality and founded the greatest kingdom of men the world had ever seen. They were the last light of the West, dimmed but not extinguished, hidden but not lost. And one day, they believed, one day the world would remember what it had forgotten. One day, a king would return. One day, the Rangers would be able to stand in the light and be acknowledged for what they were and what they had done. Until that day came, they would keep walking their patrol routes, keep fighting their unseen battles, keep holding the line, because that was what they did. That was who they were. They were the Rangers of the North, the Dúnedain, and they would not yield. Yet even among these wandering guardians, there was leadership, there was continuity, there was a line of succession carefully maintained across the generations. The story of the chieftains is the story of 16 men spread across more than 1,000 years, each bearing the impossible weight of leadership for a dwindling people, each trying to keep alive a hope that must have seemed increasingly futile with each passing generation. Yet the line never broke. From Aranarth, who chose to be chieftain rather than claim an empty kingship, to Aragorn, who would finally restore what had been lost, the succession remained intact, unbroken, a single thread of continuity running through centuries of darkness. This unbroken line was no accident and no easy achievement. It required careful planning, tremendous sacrifice, and more than a little luck. Each generation faced the very real possibility of ending the line. A chieftain killed before he could have an heir, a son dying in childhood from disease or misadventure, the slow attrition of living in a dangerous world. But somehow, each time, the line survived. Aranarth, the first chieftain, set the pattern that all would follow. He lived from the year 1953 to 2006 of the Third Age, serving as chieftain for 230 years. He saw the fall of Fornost, the death of his father, the transformation of his people from kingdom to tribe. He established the close relationship with Rivendell, that would sustain the Dúnedain. He showed by example what it meant to lead without the trappings of power, to be first among equals rather than a king on a throne. Aranarth's son, Arahal, faced a new challenge, the long aftermath of Angmar's fall. With the Witch King driven out and his kingdom destroyed, there was a brief hope that perhaps Arnor could be rebuilt, that the Dúnedain could reclaim their cities and re-establish their kingdom. But this hope proved false. The cities were too damaged, the population too small, the memory of terror too fresh. The people of Eriador were not ready to live in Fornost again, not ready to rebuild Anuminas. And so the Dúnedain remained in the angle, remained rangers, and Arahal learned that being chieftain meant accepting limitation, accepting that restoration might not come in his lifetime. For several generations, a period historians call the Watchful Peace, things were relatively quiet. Sauron had been driven from Dol Guldur by the White Council and was hiding somewhere in the east, recovering his strength. Without his direct influence, evil was less organized, less purposeful. Orcs still existed, but they acted in small bands rather than great armies. The ranger's job became more one of policing than warfare, dealing with scattered threats rather than facing existential danger. Arganui, the 10th chieftain, saw the end of this peace. In the year 2460 of the Third Age, Sauron returned to Dol Guldur openly, declaring himself once more. Evil in Middle-earth, which had been scattered and disorganized, suddenly had direction again, had a will guiding it. The orcs became bolder. Things stirred in the mountains. The rangers found their patrols increasingly dangerous, their battles increasingly desperate. Then came the fell winter of 2758, when the cold was so terrible that white wolves crossed the frozen river Brandywine and invaded the Shire. The rangers fought them back, but it was a near thing, one of the closest calls the Shire had ever experienced. The rangers themselves suffered terribly that winter, with many dying from exposure, and others falling in combat against the wolf packs. It was a reminder that even in the relative peace of the Third Age, the wild lands could still kill you just as dead as any orc blade. Through all these trials, each chieftain faced a personal challenge that was perhaps harder than any enemy, the burden of maintaining hope when hope seemed foolish. They were preserving a claim to a kingdom that no longer existed, maintaining a bloodline for a restoration that might never come. With each generation, with each century, the memory of Arnor became more distant, more like myth than history. How do you tell your son that he is being raised in secret, trained in combat and leadership, prepared for a kingship that may never be his? How do you maintain traditions and pride in a heritage that the rest of the world has forgotten? Yet they did maintain it. Each chieftain raised his son to know exactly who he was, what he represented, what duty he carried. Each taught the names and deeds of all the ancestors back to Isildur and beyond. Each instilled in the next generation the same unshakable commitment to service and protection. It was a chain of transmission, knowledge and obligation passed from father to son across the centuries, never weakening, never breaking. The chieftains also bore a more immediate burden. They were targets. Sauron knew that the line of Isildur still existed, knew that while it endured, the possibility of a true king of Gondor returning remained alive. He would have dearly loved to break that line, to kill the last heir and end the threat forever. This made being chieftain actively dangerous in ways that being a regular ranger was not. Enemies did not just want to kill the chieftain in battle. They wanted to find him, hunt him specifically, destroy the leadership of the Dúnedain. Aragorn I, the fifth chieftain, was slain by wolves in eastern Eriador in 2327. It was no ordinary wolf pack, but a large force, perhaps organized by the enemy, and they caught him separated from his companions. He fought bravely, killing many, but in the end, he was overwhelmed and torn apart. He was 100 years old, in his prime, and he died doing his duty as a ranger. His death was mourned, but his son Araglas took up the title and the work continued. Arador, the 14th chieftain, met a similar fate, but from trolls rather than wolves. In 2930, he was hunting hill trolls in the Coldfells north of Rivendell, trolls that had been raiding the roads and needed to be eliminated. His party found the trolls' lair, but there were more of them than expected. In the battle that followed, Arador was killed. He was 110 years old, and like Aragorn I, he died in service to the protection of others. Arathorn II, Arador's son and Aragorn's father, had the briefest tenure as chieftain in the history of the line. He became chieftain in 2930 at age 58, after his father's death. Just 3 years later, in 2933, he went out with Elladan and Elrohir, the sons of Elrond, to hunt a band of orcs that had been raiding near the borders of Rivendell. In the fighting, an orc shot an arrow that took Arathorn in the eye. He died instantly. He was only 60 years old, younger than many rangers lived to be even in that dangerous time. He had been chieftain for 3 years. His son Aragorn was only 2 years old. Arathorn's death was particularly tragic because it was so sudden, so apparently random. There was nothing special about that particular band of orcs, nothing that suggested this raid would be more dangerous than any of the countless others. It was simply bad luck, a random arrow fired in the chaos of combat finding a gap in his defenses. But that was the reality of the ranger's existence. Any battle could be your last. Any patrol could end in death. The chieftains were not immune to this reality. They could not be, because they led from the front, fighting alongside their people rather than directing from safety. With Arathorn dead and his heir still an infant, Elrond and the other wise leaders faced a critical decision. The heir of Isildur was vulnerable, a child who could be found and killed by Sauron's agents if they learned of his existence. So they made the decision to hide Aragorn's identity, even from himself, to raise him in Rivendell under a different name, to protect him not just physically, but through secrecy. Aragorn grew up as Estel, which means hope in Elvish, not learning his true name or heritage until he came of age at 20. This decision by Elrond was wise but also heartbreaking. It meant that Aragorn's mother, Gilraen, had to give up raising her son in any meaningful way, had to step back and let him be raised by elves who could better protect and teach him. It meant that Aragorn grew up not knowing his father, not knowing anything of his family beyond what Elrond chose to reveal. It meant that a young boy who should have been learning to be a ranger alongside his people instead learned to be something different, something more elvish in his outlook and manner. When Elrond finally revealed the truth to Aragorn on his 20th birthday, it changed everything. Imagine being told that you are not who you thought you were, that you are actually the heir to a line of kings, that you carry a responsibility stretching back thousands of years, that you are the focus of the enemy's hatred and the hope of the free peoples all at once. Elrond gave Aragorn the ring of Barahir, the ancient heirloom, and showed him the shards of Narsil, the sword that had defeated Sauron, but was broken. He told him that one day, if he proved worthy, if circumstances aligned, that sword might be reforged, and that he might be the one to bear it. Aragorn's immediate response to this revelation was telling. He did not celebrate his heritage or demand recognition. Instead, he left Rivendell and went out into the wild to become a ranger, to earn his place among his people through service rather than claiming it through blood. He spent the next several decades ranging across Eriador, fighting the same battles his father and grandfather had fought, living the same hard life. He was not just a chieftain in waiting. He was a working ranger, and he would remain one until circumstance finally called him to his greater destiny. Each of the chieftains, in their own way, embodied this same humility, this same commitment to service over status. They could have declared themselves kings at any time. They had the legitimacy, the bloodline, the theoretical right. But they understood that kingship without a kingdom was meaningless, that titles without power were just empty words. Better to be a chieftain who actually led and protected his people than a king with no realm to rule. The chieftains also maintained certain traditions and privileges that connected them to their royal heritage. They bore the royal names, always taking a name with the prefix Ara, meaning kingly. They wore the ring of Barahir when it was in their possession, as a symbol of their authority and heritage. They alone among the Dúnedain had the right to claim the title, heir of Isildur. These were small things perhaps, but they mattered. They were reminders that the line had not been broken, that the connection to Númenor and Elendil and Isildur still existed, undiminished by time or misfortune. The chieftains also bore another burden that is easy to overlook, the weight of prophecy and expectation. There were ancient prophecies about the return of the king, about the sword that was broken being made whole, about the doom of Sauron being tied to the return of Isildur's heir. The chieftains knew these prophecies. They were reminded of them constantly by Elrond and Gandalf, and others who watched the unfolding of events in Middle-earth. And each chieftain had to wonder, would it be in his lifetime that these prophecies came true? Or would he simply pass the burden to his son, another link in the chain, waiting for a fulfillment that might never come? For 15 generations, the answer was not yet. 15 chieftains lived and died without seeing the restoration of the kingdom. 15 men bore the weight of hope and prophecy and passed it unfulfilled to their sons. It would have been easy to give up, to declare that the prophecies were false, that the kingdom would never be restored, that they should simply accept their fate as eternal guardians in the shadows. But they did not give up. They kept faith. They kept the line unbroken. And in the 16th generation, in Aragorn, son of Arathorn, that faith was finally rewarded. The prophecies came true. The sword was reforged. The king returned. But that story belongs to a later chapter. For now, it is enough to say that the chieftains achieved what they set out to achieve. They kept the line alive, kept the hope alive, kept the possibility alive, until the moment when possibility became reality. The chieftains of the Dúnedain were not conquerors or empire builders. They did not leave behind monuments or great works that future ages would marvel at. What they left behind was simpler and perhaps more valuable, an unbroken line of succession, a living link to the ancient past, a preserved heritage that could be claimed when the time was right. They were keepers, not creators, preservers rather than innovators. And in their way, they were heroes, though history rarely remembers their names or celebrates their deeds. From Aranath to Aragorn, 16 men across 1,000 years, each carrying the weight of a fallen kingdom on their shoulders, each doing his duty without complaint or expectation of reward, each passing the burden faithfully to the next generation. This was the line of the chieftains, and it was never broken. And in that 16th generation, in Aragorn, son of Arathorn, all the waiting, all the sacrifice, all the faith finally found its purpose. Of all the chieftains of the Dúnedain, none bore a heavier burden than Aragorn, the last. His story is well known from the great histories, but it bears retelling here, for in his life we see the culmination of everything the Rangers had been working toward, the final justification for 1,000 years of sacrifice and patient endurance. After learning his true identity at age 20, Aragorn spent decades earning his place among his people. He became one of the finest rangers of his generation, but he did not limit himself to Eriador. Gandalf sent him on what amounted to a long training mission, and for years Aragorn travelled under different names to different lands, gaining experience and knowledge, proving himself in different contexts. He went south to Gondor and served as a warrior under the name Thorongil, Eagle of the Star. He served first King Thengel of Rohan, then steward Ecthelion of Gondor. Under that name, he became one of the most celebrated captains in Gondor's military, leading raids against the corsairs of Umbar, advising on strategy against Mordor, winning victories that saved thousands of lives. The people of Gondor loved Thorongil. He was brave, skilled, wise, everything a leader should be. But he was also a mystery. No one knew where he came from, who his father was, what his background might be. There was a rivalry between him and Denethor, Ecthelion's son, who correctly suspected that Thorongil was more than he seemed and feared he might be trying to claim the throne of Gondor. This rivalry would have consequences later, but for the moment, Thorongil served faithfully, then departed suddenly, vanishing without explanation. He travelled east and north, ranging into lands that few of the free peoples ever visited. He explored Rhûn and Harad. He learned the ways of different cultures and peoples. He gathered intelligence about the enemy's movements and preparations. He became, in effect, Gandalf's agent in the wider world. During all this travelling, Aragorn also wrestled with a personal burden, his love for Arwen. He had met her when he returned to Rivendell as a young man, fresh from learning his true identity, and he had fallen in love with her instantly. She was as beautiful as Luthien herself, the most beautiful of all the elves of the First Age. But she was also the daughter of Elrond, and Elrond had told Aragorn bluntly that he would not consent to their marriage unless Aragorn first became king of both Gondor and Arnor. This was an impossible condition, or nearly so. Aragorn would have to reclaim the throne of Gondor, which had been empty for 1,000 years and was held by stewards who might not surrender it willingly. He would have to rebuild Arnor, which had lain in ruins for a millennium. He would have to, somehow, bring about the downfall of Sauron, because only then could the kingdoms be truly restored. It was a test, but it was also Elrond's way of protecting his daughter. He loved Arwen, and did not want to see her choose mortality for someone who had not proven himself worthy beyond all doubt. Aragorn accepted this challenge. He would become king, not just for his own sake, not just to restore his inheritance, but also for Arwen. Love became another motivation, layered on top of duty and heritage and all the other reasons he had to strive for the throne. By the time the War of the Ring began, Aragorn was in his late 80s, but still in his prime by the standards of the Dúnedain. He looked perhaps 40 by normal human standards, weathered and hard-worn, but strong and capable. He had spent 6 decades ranging through Eriador and traveling the world. He had fought more battles than he could count, had saved more lives than he knew, had become a legend among those few who knew his true identity, while remaining unknown to the wider world. When Gandalf needed someone to help protect Frodo and the Ring, Aragorn was the natural choice. He introduced himself as Strider, a rough ranger, and the hobbits were immediately suspicious of him. He looked dangerous, weathered, grim, but he guided them safely through the wild, fought off the Nazgul at Weathertop despite being vastly outnumbered, and delivered them to Rivendell. At the Council of Elrond, Aragorn finally revealed himself, claimed the shards of Narsil publicly, declared his intention to claim the throne. It was, in a sense, the beginning of his transformation from ranger to king. But he would not complete that transformation quickly or easily. He would have to earn kingship through deed, not simply claim it by blood. The journey of the Fellowship was, for Aragorn, a test of leadership. He had to guide the company through the wilderness, make tactical decisions, balance competing interests and personalities, keep everyone alive against impossible odds. When Gandalf fell in Moria, Aragorn had to step up and become the de facto leader of the Fellowship, a role he had not sought but could not refuse. After the Fellowship broke at Amon Hen, Aragorn faced perhaps his greatest test. The ring was gone, carried by Frodo into Mordor. Merry and Pippin had been captured by orcs. Boromir had fallen defending the hobbits. Aragorn had to choose: pursue Frodo and try to help him with the ring, or go after Merry and Pippin and try to rescue them. He chose to go after the hobbits, trusting that Frodo would have to complete his mission alone. It was a leader's choice, prioritizing the people he could actually save over the mission he could not effect. The pursuit of the orcs across Rohan, the meeting with Éomer and then with King Theoden, the Battle of Helm's Deep, the march to Isengard. All of these events saw Aragorn growing into his role as king. He was commanding armies now, making strategic decisions, representing the interests of Gondor and Arnor, even though he had not yet claimed those titles officially. He was becoming visible, becoming known, becoming a figure that people would follow. But the greatest test was still ahead. Aragorn learned that Gondor would face assault from the Corsairs of Umbar, as well as from Mordor itself. The city would be caught between two armies and crushed. The only way to prevent this was to somehow deal with the Corsairs before they could arrive. And the only way to reach them in time was to take the paths of the dead, a haunted road that no living man had successfully traversed in thousands of years. With him would ride 30 rangers of the north, the Grey Company, who had come south in answer to his call. These men represented the best of the Dúnedain, volunteers who had left their patrol territories in Eriador to join their chieftain in what everyone understood might be a suicide mission. The Grey Company was led by Halbarad, Aragorn's kinsman, and one of the most respected rangers of the north. With them, they brought a standard, a great banner sewn in black cloth, upon which was wrought in silver the signs of Elendil, a white tree above a crown and 7 stars, the standard of the king waiting to be unfurled. The journey through the paths of the dead was as terrible as legend claimed. They travelled through absolute blackness, through tunnels that had not seen living men in thousands of years, feeling the weight of the dead pressing on them from all sides. But at the Stone of Eric, Aragorn commanded them, declared himself the heir of Isildur, and called upon them to fulfill their oath at last. The dead had waited 3,000 years for this moment, and now their oathkeeper had come at last to offer them release. The dead followed Aragorn to the harbours where the corsair ships were gathering, and at Aragorn's command they swept through the enemy. The ships were taken, and Aragorn sailed them to Minas Tirith, arriving at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields just when all seemed lost. But there was a cost. Halbarad, bearing the standard that Arwen had made, fell in battle. He died holding the standard high, died ensuring that all could see the sign of the king. His death was mourned, but the battle continued, and the Rangers fought on, as they always had. When Sauron finally fell, and the War of the Ring ended, Aragorn claimed his inheritance at last. He was crowned King Elessar, becoming the 26th King of Arnor and the 35th King of Gondor, the first High King of the reunited kingdom. The line that had been preserved through 1,000 years of hardship and loss had finally produced a king again. The Rangers' long watch was over. The kingdom was restored. As we reach the end of this long journey through the history of the Dúnedain, it is worth pausing to consider what their story truly means. The story of the Dúnedain Rangers is not just a tale of adventure and heroism, though it contains both in abundance. It is also a meditation on duty, sacrifice, nobility, and the meaning of hope in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. The Rangers embodied certain virtues that deserve examination, certain ideas that resonate beyond the specific context of Middle-earth. First and foremost, the Rangers demonstrated that true nobility is not about wealth or power or recognition, but about service. They were descended from kings, the highest nobility, yet they lived as homeless wanderers, owning nothing, claiming nothing. They could have demanded recognition, could have insisted on their rights and privileges. Instead, they chose to serve, to protect, to guard people who did not even know they existed. This is nobility in its purest form. Duty without expectation of reward, service without requirement of acknowledgement. The Rangers also embodied a particular kind of hope, one that is not naive optimism, but rather a grim determination to continue, despite overwhelming evidence that success is impossible. They did not believe that the kingdom would be restored because they had received assurances or seen signs. They believed it because they chose to believe it, because the alternative was despair and surrender. This is hope as an act of will, hope as a defiance of circumstance, hope that exists not because the situation is favorable, but precisely because it is not. There is also something profound in the way the Rangers maintained their identity across so many generations without the normal structures that preserve culture. They had no schools, no libraries, no established institutions. What they had was memory, oral tradition, and the fierce commitment to passing on their heritage to the next generation. They proved that culture can survive even the destruction of all its material expressions if the people carrying that culture refuse to let it die. The relationship between the Rangers and the people they protected raises interesting questions about the nature of duty and gratitude. The Rangers protected the Shire and Bree without asking permission and without expecting thanks. The people they protected did not request this protection and did not know they were receiving it. Can there be duty without acknowledgement? Can there be service without gratitude? The Rangers answered these questions through their actions. Yes, there can be. And sometimes that is the highest form of service. There is also tragedy in the Rangers' story. Many died fighting battles that no one would remember, protecting people who would never know they had been saved. Halbarad died holding the king's standard, his name barely mentioned in the histories. How many other Rangers died equally heroic deaths that were not recorded at all? The Rangers accepted this anonymity as the price of their service. They were content to be forgotten as long as the people they protected remained safe. The theme of endurance runs through the entire history of the Dúnedain. They endured when everything suggested they should give up. They endured when kingdoms rose and fell around them. They endured through plague and war and endless hardship. They proved that sometimes the greatest heroism is not dramatic action, but simply refusing to quit, continuing to do your duty day after day, year after year, century after century. The Rangers also represent a particular relationship with the past. They were living in the ruins of their ancestors' civilization, walking roads that their forefathers built, watching over lands that their forefathers ruled. They were surrounded by evidence of decline and fall, yet they chose to remember that decline as a temporary setback rather than a final verdict. They chose to see themselves as the inheritors of ancient glory rather than as survivors of ancient catastrophe. The restoration of the kingdom, when it finally came, vindicated the Rangers' faith, but also marked the end of their particular way of life. The Rangers, as wandering guardians living apart from civilization, ceased to exist in the Fourth Age. They were integrated into the restored kingdom, became part of a larger society. In a sense, the Rangers succeeded themselves out of existence, achieved their goal, and thereby made themselves obsolete. Yet for all this complexity, the basic message of the Rangers' story remains clear and powerful. Duty matters, heritage matters, keeping faith matters, even when success seems impossible and recognition seems unlikely. The Rangers proved that a small number of dedicated individuals, united by common purpose and willing to sacrifice everything, can preserve something precious across vast spans of time until circumstances allow it to flourish again. The Rangers of the North are gone now, integrated into history, transformed by their own success. But their example remains. In the literature of Middle-earth, they represent the best of what humanity can be, noble without arrogance, strong without cruelty, dutiful without expecting reward, hopeful without being naive, enduring without being passive. They were the guardians in the shadows, the keepers of a trust that no one else remembered, and they kept faith across 1,000 years until a king returned at last. Their story is worth remembering, not because it provides easy answers or comfortable lessons, but because it reminds us that some things are worth preserving even when preservation seems futile, that some duties are worth keeping even when no one is watching, that some hopes are worth maintaining even when hope itself seems foolish. The Rangers kept walking their patrol routes, kept watching the borders, kept the line unbroken, because that was what they had chosen to do and who they had chosen to be. And in the end, after 1,000 years of waiting, after countless small battles and unnamed sacrifices, after generations of men who lived hard and died young, in service to a dream they would never see fulfilled. The king returned. The kingdom was restored. The Rangers' long watch ended not in despair, but in triumph, proving that even the most impossible hope can sometimes, just sometimes, come true if enough people are willing to carry it through the darkness until dawn finally breaks. That is the legacy of the Dúnedain, the Rangers of the North, and it is a legacy worth honoring. If you enjoyed this exploration of the Dúnedain Rangers and their place in the rich history of Middle-earth, I hope you'll consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are countless other corners of Tolkien's legendarium realm. Explore. Countless other stories waiting to be told around the fire. Until next time, may your paths be safe, may your burdens be light, and may you always remember that sometimes the greatest heroism is simply refusing to give up, even when the darkness seems endless and dawn impossibly distant. The Rangers knew this truth, lived it for 1,000 years, and in the end, they saw the sunrise they had waited for. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the wild lands and forgotten roads of Arnor. Good night.